No, it's not me.
Anyone at this table over here? You were having a very lively discussion just a moment ago. Do you want me to pick someone?
So maybe you should be around.
Michael's volunteering? Okay, great. Perfect. Thank you, Michael. Bravo.
I have a lot of opinions, but I don't know very much, so that's
That's okay. So, how this will work is that if at any point you don't know what to say, you can just turn to the audience and ask for a suggestion. And that can be like a fact, or it can be expressing your values, or anything else that you think would be. Okay, right?
yeah. Sorry, so I missed a little bit of the start, so I'm not really sure. Am I anti? Am I in favor? What am I? I really don't know what I'm doing.
No worries. So I'm gonna be one of your neighbors who's in favor of gas plants.
Oh, I saw.
Yes. And so, or maybe he doesn't know that much about them.
Okay.
Yeah. And you're gonna be someone who cares about our collective future and climate change.
Okay.
Ready?
Sure.
Boy, Michael, I'm so glad they're finally building that new gas plant, eh?
You're glad about that.
Yeah, it's about time. You know, they keep talking about it. About time they get it done.
Okay, I'm curious. What are you excited about? Like, what does that bring for you to make you happy about that?
Oh, you know, I guess it'll make our electricity cheaper.
Oh. Why do you say that?
Well, it's got to, right? If you generate more, it's like supply and demand. If you generate more electricity, it's got to be cheaper.
Yeah, I'm not too sure, right? Because there's a lot of other costs that we're going to pay, whether that's a financial cost up front when they're putting in all these new lines for this new gas plant, or if it's increased delivery because now they have more gas that they can try to sell to us, or, you know, the long-term cost, right? Like for my kids or my grandkids, I'm kind of worried about that actually, like what that cost might be, even if I'm not paying it right now, you know?
Yeah, but I mean, surely it's going to be cheaper, right?
How do you define, this is my thing, how do you define cheaper though, right? Like sure, it's going to cost me a little bit less each month, maybe, but that's nice. Don't disagree with you there. But if it's going to mean a decreased quality of life, right, for my kids, for me, my family, I don't know. I don't know that it's necessarily cheaper in all the other ways that matter, you know?
What kind of ways?
Like our health, right? And so, who said something here? Pollution, breathing. Yeah, pollution, breathing. Do you remember a few? I think it was last year when, although it wasn't a gas plant on fire, that there were forests that were burning down, and it was so hard to breathe. And it wasn't even burning here in Kingston, but it was so hard to breathe. I just worry about, like, that was a horrible time to go outside. And I would worry about like long-term effects on our air quality, our pollution, because of these factories. Like, I don't want to be in my old age having to breathe in that, gross air, right? Especially if it's so close to us. It's like, you try opening your window on a hot summer night, and all you're gonna get is gas pollution.
Wow, sure, but electricity's got to come from somewhere, right?
Yeah, there's so many other ways we could do it, right? We could do, a lot of places have hydro-powered, places, as well as nuclear energy is a really good option if we can build it and maintain it and keep it going, as well as solar energy. Like, there's so many, I forget the name of it, but it's where it's the hydrothermal, I think, energy. Like, there's so many different ways we can do it other than, like, destroying our Earth, right? Or ways that we can destroy our Earth less, at least, for now, than burning gas to have energy.
Buy hydro from Quebec.
Oh, If you really wanted to, you could buy some hydro from the French people in Quebec.
Eric, there's one thing comment I want to make that, you know, when there was a coal-fired plant in Toronto, I mean, everybody here from Eastern Ontario going into Toronto that done it years ago, you could go a long time before you even came close to Toronto, you could see this horrible red cloud hanging over the city, and now it's gone, you know. And I think that's something that's very visible to people, especially from Eastern Ontario, to understand. Lived in Toronto, it wasn't quite as dramatic, but it used to be horrible trying to go to Toronto and see this pollution. You know,
Yeah.
this horrible red cloud hanging over the city.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's amazing how much things have changed. You know, I mentioned growing up in Northern Ontario, and like the air quality in the like mill towns and around the smelters has changed so much in a couple of decades up there even too.
Beijing.
Oh, yeah, Beijing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Michael did a really great job there in that role play. What did people observe in terms of Michael's approach?
Oh, I was
Sylvia?
going to mention your approach. You really seem to have only one drum to beat.
Mhm. Yeah.
And that's often what we face, isn't it?
Yeah, I definitely think there was a lot more listening happening on one side of that conversation than the other. Yeah.
Well, I was impressed at how non-confrontational Michael was. He just sort of probed, why do you think this, and where, just trying to follow up with you rather than tell you what he thought.
Yeah.
A generous listener.
A generous listener, yeah, well put, yeah. Any other observations? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that Michael did a fantastic job of bringing together a bunch of different reasons to oppose gas plants, and some different reasons, some different alternatives. One thing that I think you could mention in this case is that those particular gas plants will actually make electricity more expensive because of the ways that the government has promised to keep paying after they're shut down. And so now renewable energy is actually cheaper. And it's interesting we've talked about nuclear as well at one of the small discussion tables. And right now, every week, China is installing solar generating capacity equivalent to 5 large nuclear reactors. And so, like, technologically, that problem is solved. It's really a question of political will and whether politicians are able to like put in the money to make that sort of thing happen. Because that sort of thing creates a lot of really good, consistent jobs as well. Okay, yes?
Where can people go to read about the specifics of the renewables being cheaper compared to the gas plants? Because people, we're just putting that out there and people are not going to necessarily take my word for it.
So in that letter, let's see. There are some links there. Oh, sorry. This is not in this version of the letter because it's a hyperlink. So it's the United Nations that have said that. But if you research United Nations cheaper energy, you should be able to find a couple of sources for that. And if you find this original letter as well, you can use that specific link. But yeah, this is like, it's not just in Canada, it's actually a global kind of phenomenon now that renewable energy is cheaper everywhere. Yes?
I'm just going to say, it's interesting that you say that China is making these strides to become greener, whereas I've heard that they're doing everything not to go that way. So that must be some of the disinformation that's spread out there. India and China are actually using more fossil fuels than they are going in the green direction. And our footprint doesn't really match, is the argument that I've heard.
Yeah, I've heard that too. And I think partly it's just based on older information and how things have changed. So, 20, 25 years ago, as China's economy and manufacturing were really expanding, they installed tons of coal-fired plants. And they were burning like soft coal that's even dirtier and more polluting than the kind that was used in Canada. So it's true that their impact was really terrible. And even this change now where they're focused more on renewable energy, I don't think that's because the government of China really cares about the planet. I think it's because they want to be energy independent, and they understand that the world is getting more unstable, and that if you depend on other people, other countries for your critical energy, then that makes you really vulnerable to them and to what their political kind of desires are. And so what I see in China is they want to generate their own electricity so that people can't tell them what to do.
So Eric, what do you say about nuclear energy? I mean, that's an argument that people make. So obviously the coal, the gas plants, the coal plants are not a good idea, but nuclear, is that a really viable option for them? Because I think that's what they're doing in a lot of European countries.
Yeah, Europe is all over the place right now on nuclear, right? Because Germany shut down after Fukushima, they phased out all of their nuclear power generation, and they actually ended up burning a lot more coal because of that, because they didn't really plan ahead enough in advance. So they hadn't built that renewable capacity to make up for it. So for me, it's about that. It's about the long-term planning. And I think there probably was a point where you could have made a really compelling argument that nuclear was could be a primary part of the solution. I think right now it's actually harder because nuclear power plants take so long to get online, right? They take potentially decades to get approved and constructed. And so that's just too long in terms of dealing with the climate emergencies and the shifts that we need to see in our electrical system. And they can be, depending on how they're built, they can be a lot more expensive than renewable energy. So for me, there are obviously tons of concerns about what do we do with all that waste? There's no plan for dealing with nuclear waste that is dangerous for millions of years potentially. But for me, it's more of a practical economic consideration that it's not possible to build that nuclear capacity cheaply and quickly. And so for me, it's kind of a low priority.
And there's also the fact that nuclear is not really renewable. It depends on uranium that has to be mined and the technology that's required for mining, which is mostly fossil fuel based, and then you have to deal with the fallout, the pollution that results, which has not been really resolved.
Or you talk about smaller nuclear plant or nuclear generators, and you say that they're very efficient. And then we use them.
But they're scary. There have been so many disasters.
Yeah, people are,
For the future.
I will say that, I'm not picking a side here, I will say that coal has killed a lot more people than nuclear. So nuclear I know is scary because of the way that it's dangerous, because it, when it kills people it does so in this kind of dramatic fashion. But things like coal have killed orders of magnitude more people because of air pollution than radiation has. I think if there's going to be kind of a nuclear solution in the next few decades, it's probably going to come more from the development of fusion. I think if there's anything, that's what the future is for nuclear energy. But also that's going to take a really long time, and it's going to take longer than we have to fix climate change. Yeah.
They have an old saying about fusion. The fusion is always 25 years in the future. 30 years ago it was 25 years in the future. It's 25 years in the future now. And it's 25 years from now, it will still be 25 years in the future. Because 25 is a number that they just pulled out of the top of their hat because they really have no idea how long, not a slightest clue, how long it will take to make fusion power viable.
Yeah, and it's part of the challenge is that if they ever do figure it out, it's like, it's extremely technologically sophisticated and expensive, and it's still, like, they might figure out how to make it work, and it still ends up being way pricier than a wind turbine. Yeah, because, I have solar panels on the top of my house, and they're safe, and they're easy to maintain, and I'm never going to have a fusion reactor at my house. Wonderful. Any last thoughts about this before we move on to the third and final part of the workshop? Please.
I worked at a nuclear plant 45 years ago, and they said, why would you bury fuel that has only about half its life in, but 45 years later, they still don't bury it.
Yeah, it's true.
That was 45 years ago.
Yes, I mean, they might have fusion figured out before they have a solution to what to do with leftover fuel rods from nuclear power plants. Yeah. Great. Okay, thank you, everybody. So our very last topic is how to work together and help each other. So this is our kind of action-oriented part of the discussion. And I'm actually going to show you some questions up front. I'm going to show these again at the end, but these are what I think about when I'm trying to decide what are some things that we should do? What are actions that we can take in our community or in our networks? Climate change. And so one of the things I ask is, what is exciting or fun, right? So what's gonna engage people or draw people in to want to take action on these issues? What actions are good at building community? Buying an electric car, that's an action that we can take as individuals, and it can have an impact on our community. But are there things that we can do together in groups, forms of collective action? How can we advocate by example? So how can we demonstrate the kinds of behaviors we want? How can we use collective action? I mentioned that. Who are our allies in this work, right? So who are the people outside of this room, maybe, who we should be working with on different projects? And lastly, how can we build climate justice into our work, right? And that's important to recognize that globally, the people who are the most at risk are the people who are least responsible for the problem. So in Bangladesh, more than 100 million people live within a few meters of sea level, and they're already experiencing agricultural problems because of rising sea levels pushing salt into their groundwater. And those people have greenhouse gas emissions per capita that are a few % of what people create in Canada. So for me, that sort of thing is about climate justice. It's not just about decreasing emissions, it's also about making sure that the people who are most vulnerable, people who are most affected, that we take action in a way that specifically helps them, and that people like big oil companies who are profiting, that they should actually be paying as much as possible for the costs of fixing the climate emergency. So I am going to give some examples of some of the things that I work on and that maybe you want to work on that do some of these things and that are part of the kind of approach that I take to climate action. We mentioned before that I am a farmer, and so we have an organic farm on Howe Island, and we grow food for about 200 different households in Kingston and the surrounding area. And we do that through the Community Shared Agriculture Model, or CSA, which means that people kind of buy and share, they buy a subscription at the start of the season. And then we offer a lot of opportunities for people to come out to visit the farm and to learn about what we do and why we do things the way that we do and to get their hands dirty. And this is a photo of a workshop we did. We actually hosted a kids camp before the pandemic for several summers, and got kids out to learn about why we do things like composting and about climate action on farm and how we can change our food system. We also think a lot on our farm about how to build habitat for wild animals, especially for endangered species, which white-tailed deer are not endangered species in our area, as you're all aware. They can be very cute. We let them into the gardens to eat things like leftover kale at the end of the season so that they have some good food in the wintertime. But one endangered species that we do have, that we have been working to help, are purple martins. So each of these, so that's grass, by the way, just so you have a sense of scale. So each of those little birds, they are smaller than a jelly bean. And so purple martins, they're the largest migratory swallow in the Americas. Let's see, I'll play that again. But they're really endangered because, basically because of habitat loss and pesticides. So pesticides, we use a lot of them in agriculture, but they kill all kinds of insects. So they don't just kill the pests that are eating people's crops, they kill insects in the entire ecosystem, in the broader biosphere. And so we didn't have any purple martins 5 years ago. We installed this special kind of housing so that we could invite them back. And since then, so this is some of the housing, it goes up and down on these kinds of poles. And it's actually, you see this weird shape, they're shaped like gourds, because so these migratory swallows, they have a really long relationship with humans. And so indigenous communities in what is now the American South, they would hang dried gourds near their fields to attract swallows like purple martins. And so they actually really like this shape. They kind of, this is part of their like genetic memory almost, is this kind of gourd shape and their relationship with humans. And the reason that we want these birds is because they're aerial insectivores. So they fly around eating insects. And in a given week, a breeding pair of purple martins who have eggs or chicks, they'll eat about 25,000 insects per week. So that's fantastic for us as organic farmers, right? Because it's basically free pest control. And so we've brought this species that we had none of them on the island 5 years ago, none of them on our farm. And then in the second year we had 4 of them, and then we had 12. And basically they've been more than doubling every year since we started. And so this year, of these chicks, these very cute chicks, these ones are ready to fledge. We had 131 of them this year, which is fantastic. And I think a really amazing recovery. For scale, this is a child's hand. This is my niece's hand. So this is a baby bird. This is what they look like shortly before when they're getting ready to fledge. And so here they are also being held by some of the Sisters of Providence who came out to visit our farm. And so when they are done fledging, they actually fly back to Latin America. They spend the winters in Brazil and countries in that area. So basically when they're just a little bit bigger than this, when they're only a few months old, they literally fly to another hemisphere, and then they come back the next year. And so this has been really fantastic because we've noticed a big decrease in the number of pests on our farm, for example. One of the questions I had put earlier on the sheet is who are our allies? And so for me, especially growing up as a kind of environmentalist in Northern Ontario, Indigenous people have often been my allies. I've worked a lot with Indigenous people, in part because they've been actually really successful in climate action. And so this is from a picture from last year. We went as a group to the March for the Land Defense Alliance, so Indigenous communities that were trying to stop unwanted mining on their lands. Some of us went again this year to a similar march by the community of Grassy Narrows. And Grassy Narrows is a community that was poisoned by mercury from the pulp and paper industry in the 1960s and onwards, and they've really been struggling for justice. But they've also been able to stop a lot of unwanted logging on their land. So the issue is that the province keeps giving permits for logging and mining on their territory, even when they don't want that to happen. And so starting around 2000, the folks at Grassy Narrows actually started a blockade of their territory. They started one of the biggest, it became the longest running Indigenous blockade in Canadian history. And they were able to essentially stop unwanted logging in their territory, which is really impressive because, well, for a bunch of different reasons, but one of those is, as you may have seen in some recent news reports, logging, if we count the carbon emissions from logging, from clear cutting, it would actually be the third biggest emitter of greenhouse gases in Canada after the oil and gas industry and transportation. So that's really important. So for me, alliances with Indigenous communities and supporting Indigenous communities are really important because the impact that that has in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and supporting people in living sustainably is actually huge. It's really gigantic, and it's way bigger than things like recycling. So in our area, there is a particular Indigenous group